Grant. Jones?
All right, it's time for us to get going tonight. It's good to see everybody. Thank you all for showing up and being here tonight. It's kind of chilly and windy outside. You know, it warms up just a little bit, and then it doesn't take much cooling off for it to feel like it's like Arctic Circle or something out there. But appreciate you all being here and looking forward to this class tonight. Before we get into it, Matt, would you lead us in the prayer, please?
In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, so we are in our study of tensions and paradoxes, and tonight our topic is grace, faith. Whether you thought about it or not, there's a bit of a paradox or a tension that lies between these two concepts, and we've kind of subtitled it God and Man in Salvation. So when it comes to grace and faith, what do we typically say is God's part? Grace. And the faith part would be what we sometimes we would think of as our contribution to that. But the tension comes in, well, where does the grace of God end and the faith of man begin? It's like there's obviously a connection between the two. Were it not for God's grace, were it not for the sending of His Son into the world, were it not for Him the giving of us of the testimony concerning His Son, revealed in the Word, and all of these things that we can associate, at least in part, with God's gracious actions toward us, there would be nothing on our part to believe in. But where exactly do we draw the line between what's God's part and what's our part? So that's the tension that we're going to be working on tonight. And Scripture has a good bit to say about this. And then on Sunday we'll be talking about more of the grace aspect to what gives us a sense of assurance in our salvation, even though we know we're not, even as we go through our lives, not perfect. We're still sinners. We still are imperfect. We still fall short in many ways. And how does grace help us to have a sense of assurance as we make our way forward? So we'll talk about that tension Sunday. But tonight, just this whole idea of God's part and man's part in salvation, and where does the one end and the other begin. So that maybe gives you some idea of where we're going. So before we jump to that, I want to just give a few reminders as best we can in this class what our objectives are. We're talking about paradox and tension, which means that there's things that seem to be pushing one way and the other way, or pulling one way and the other way, and or things that seem to be kind of working in opposite directions. And our desire that there's something just innate in our nature is always to want to just resolve the tension. We want the tension to just go away. But generally speaking, when we solve a tension by, we often do that by beating down one half of the paradox so much so that we end up losing something really valuable. We kind of set that idea up with the deity and humanity of Jesus, and that was one of our earliest lessons, because it's one in which I think we can all pretty quickly see that if you deny the deity of Jesus in order to boost His humanity, you lose something essential. But at the same time, if you try to resolve the paradox by exalting the deity of Jesus and repressing the humanity of Jesus, you lose something equally important. And so sometimes we have to learn to live with that tension and hold on to both. And I think that's something we also find as we think about God's grace and man's faith as a response to that, and where the one ends and the other begins. Now, we want to resolve that tension as much as possible, but not to the extent that we find ourselves denying certain things that the Bible teaches. So we'll see that as we go on. Now, resolutions like this topic tonight become exceedingly more difficult to address once they become sort of institutionalized, where you get one camp of people who say, well, God's grace is everything. It's the whole show, and in fact, God's grace just sort of totally encompasses our faith as well. It's our very faith is totally God's gift. It's just sort of a miraculous thing that God gives to us. If you go to that level or extreme, then you're going to find yourself sort of in one camp, and another is just like, no, it's just God did His thing, and now it's just totally on my part. I'm doing my thing, and we kind of meet in the middle. You find yourself in a different camp, and you start coming up with labels for each other, and you pretty quickly find yourself unable to think or speak very independently because you're wanting so much to identify with your group. And you also begin to find yourself saying things about the other side's position that maybe they would not accept as an accurate description of what they really believe. And I know that that's the truth, because when it comes to some of the discussion that we're going to consider tonight, I definitely have had people who I've sort of debated or argued or tried to study through these issues with before, who have said that my view means that I think something that I'm like, no, I don't think that's right at all. And I've also seen a lot of instances in which people who tend to think more like I do on the issue, accusing people on other sides of the issue of thinking things that they would say, no, that really doesn't represent my point of view either. So we need to be careful of that. And also remember that just because, say, a position A is incorrect doesn't mean that not A is correct. Does that make sense? Just because something that you affirmed that's not quite right, doesn't mean the opposite of that therefore is right. Okay? In fact, that's sometimes the way these things become more and more extreme, and you find people sort of reacting. You see it in the political realm sort of all the time, but it happens in religious discussions and ideas as well. One person affirms one thing, and then somebody immediately, their response is to just react by espousing the polar opposite, and then back and forth until both camps get driven in further and further away from each other. And in order to try to avoid some of that, I'm going to use some labels tonight that are not as common as might be used in this discussion to try to help mitigate some of that tendency. And I'm going to talk about Monarchism and Synergism. How many of you guys are like, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about there? Hopefully, like very few. Yeah, we got a few. Well, basically, the idea that I'm going here was that a monergistic view of the God and man dichotomy of salvation would say that it's all one. And generally speaking, you would say it's all God. Beginning to end, start to finish, all the way through the middle, salvation is totally God's doing. And man doesn't really play any significant part in that. That would be sort of the extreme view of that. Yes, Steve? Well, that's kind of part of what I'm trying to avoid. Calvin, well, I don't know that. Yeah. I think if John Calvin were here today, he would say, no, that's a mischaracterization of what I actually believe. But commonly, I think we would say that Calvin is more in the direction of monergistic in his view that God's kind of doing the whole thing. So then, the synergism would be more like, no, God's doing his part, I'm doing my part over here, and the two are working together in this process. So that's kind of the way that I want to set some of this forward. And the question that I would like to start with is simply this: at his best, say the monergist, at his best, let's kind of try to give him the benefit of the doubt that he's not just an evil person who's trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes. What might he be trying to uphold? What might he be seeing as something really valuable and important to uphold? Yes.
The sovereignty of God's will.
Okay, the sovereignty of God. That God is not just out of control, just wondering what in the world's going on, what's happening, and all that. So he wants to uphold the sovereignty of God, and that's exactly the right. And that's a good thing to want to uphold, right? That God is in control, God is sovereign. One way we might phrase it is like this: the monergist desires to give God all the glory and to exclude all human boasting, or all grounds for human boasting, in particularly in the work of salvation. And so he would argue that faith is wholly located in God's grace and sovereign work. And one way to think about that is looking at, for instance, something like Revelation 5, right, where you have the problem where no one is found worthy to open the scroll. And finally, as John is weeping, someone says to him, "No, look, there's one who is worthy." So one is found who is worthy, and that is the Lamb that was slain, and he comes and takes the scroll. And then you begin to have this cascading expression of worship and praise, right? And you have all of creation ultimately surrounding the throne. And what are they doing? They're saying all what? All authority, all glory, all honor, all praise is going in what direction? To the Lamb and to the one who's seated on the throne, right? This person's position would be, I want to defend against the idea that for all eternity, the one on the throne and the Lamb are looking at all the people around them and saying, worthy are you because you made a good choice, okay? That is a concern to them. And we want to maintain the sovereignty of God, the honor of God, and that all praise and glory would go to God for his wondrous work of salvation wrought on our behalf. Does that make some sense? I'm not saying that they're right about that, but at least I think if we can begin at a place where we see what their concerns would be, it will help us to better understand why they think the way that they think. Now, on the other hand, at his best, what would the synergist be trying to uphold? Maybe a little bit more.
Man's role in his salvation.
Yeah, the free will of man would be a big thing that he's trying to uphold, that this feeling that you and I have, that we're making choices, and that these choices are real, that they're really my choices, that's not just an illusion, that's actually the reality. And I think that's an important thing to hold on to. If we push the monergistic point of view far enough, it really does come down to the idea that, well, what seems to me to be making a decision and a choice is really kind of not so much a real thing. It's just sort of, I'm more of a puppet. And so the synergistic person is concerned about that. Another thing that he's equally concerned about, and I've chosen to put this one up because it pairs well with what the monergist concern would be, is that he's concerned about the desire to proclaim God's love for all humanity, for every single human person, and to boldly declare that God does not desire the loss of any human. Because one of the consequences of the monergistic point of view at its extreme would be that people who are saved because that is God's election. He elected that. That's his choice. And that those who are lost, not that God wanted them to be lost, but he did not choose for his grace to reach them in such a way that they would come to saving faith in Christ. And that seems to run counter with the character of God and with any number of specific passages that we could point to about God's not willing that any should perish, but that all would come to the knowledge of the truth. So you can see that both sides of this would be kind of coming at the problem from different perspectives and have some legitimate concerns and fear of what the other person's point of view might mean, where this might take us. So I think that maybe, I hope, helps set us up a little bit as we look at some passages. And I've chosen passages that don't necessarily favor one point of view over the other. Because often what happens in this kind of debate is that one group has its set of passages, the other group has its set of passages, and both groups say, well, my passages have the priority, and if you would interpret your obscure passages in the light of my passages, then everything would make sense. And then the other group says, no, it's our passages that deserve the priority, and if you'll just interpret your obscure, weird passages in light of this, then it'll all make sense. Well, I've chosen some that I think make it hard for either side to do that. So I hope that this works. All right, Titus 2, verses 11 and 12. This is all, I think all of my quotations tonight are in the ESV. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people. Would there be anything in that statement? Well, my pointer doesn't work on that. Riley. Okay, Titus 2, 11 and 12. Is there anything here about God's grace having appeared, bringing salvation to all people? Which side of the Monarchism, Synergism camp might that favor? The Synergism, because it's a grace that's available or has appeared to who? All people. Okay, not the elect, as it were, but it's a grace universally available to all mankind, and it's a grace that brings salvation to all people, and it's a grace that does something. It trains us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. So God's grace has appeared to all. And it teaches us to do certain things. Now, again, this is God's doing that brings salvation, but it's a salvation available to all. But not all people, obviously, embrace this salvation, right? All right. Look at Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith. Okay, so here definitely, I'm sorry, I knew something was missing here. I just couldn't get it in my mind what I wanted to talk about. So this grace of God has appeared to all people, and it's doing what? It's training who? Us to do what? To renounce ungodliness. We're doing something. We're denying worldly passions. We're learning to live self-controlled, upright lives. Who's doing that? Yeah, we are. We are. But you could also say, well, why are we doing that? No, because His grace has appeared to us, right? So God has taken an initiative to do something, to bring grace to us in such a way that it draws out of us something. So there is an interconnectedness to this, isn't there? And again, where does the one begin? Where's the other end? There's something about the grace of God, something about the message that he communicates to us that awakens within us something that wasn't there before. Power now exists to deny certain things that before I just gave myself over to. But God's grace has intervened in this way. And yet, he phrases it in such a way that he's saying that it's taught us to behave this way. So it's God's grace, but it's my response of obedience or faith here. So moving from there, let's look at Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. This one is kind of central to the discussion. For by grace you have been saved. So saved by grace, yes. By grace you have been saved through faith. So God has graciously acted in our behalf. We have responded to this grace through faith. And then this is the kind of the controversial part. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. Now, you can go online and find endless amounts of debate as to exactly what the grammar demands. And I don't really think that the grammar is going to settle the issue. But the question becomes what? It's kind of focused in on this word.
Is faith really our doing?
What?
Is faith really our doing?
Yeah, is faith our doing, or is it the gift that God gave us? So salvation is by grace through faith, and it, that is faith, is a gift of God. God gives, again, the elect, those who respond in faith, he gives them their faith, so that it removes all ground of boasting, which kind of takes us back to what I was talking about at the beginning, and is the concern of the monarchist that no one is saying, I'm a Christian, I'm saved, and they're not. And the reason is because I believe. I'm basically better than they are. They, if they would believe, they could be as good as me. And they're like, that's a concern. So we want to say that faith itself is a gift divinely given to us so that it removes all ground of boasting. But you can easily, just as easily say, well, no, that it's referring to what? Yeah, to salvation in general, not specifically to faith in particular, but that all of God's saving work in sending his Son into the world and giving us the ground of our salvation in the gospel is God's gift, without which none of us would have any hope. And that when we place our confidence, our trust, our faith in what God has done for us, that's our part. So as it were, you have God acting in grace and man responding in faith. And in any case, it's not of our works that we somehow generated this gospel so that we may boast. Let's look at a couple others that I think will take us a little bit deeper into this. In Philippians 1 verse 6, he says, and this is Philippians 1 and 2, I'm just kind of pushing all this together. Paul, writing to the church of Philippi, says, I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you. So, who begins this good work? Yeah, God's at work in you. God started this. He's turned you from darkness to light. He's brought you out of this and put you in his kingdom. And, he's turning you into this masterpiece of his design. He started this process, and he's going to bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. And then, jumping to chapter 2, verse 12, he says, Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So God began this work, and He's going to complete it, but that doesn't mean that you're totally passive in this process, does it? You're called to work this out, you work out what God has begun, what God is working in. God's grace has appeared, and it's teaching you to deny ungodliness and to have self-control. And you're working out the implications of what God's grace has worked in. Does that make sense? And who's working? You are doing this. You are obeying. You are doing it when I'm present. You're doing it when I'm absent. And I want you to continue to do this and to do it with fear and trembling. Whose fear and whose trembling? Yeah, yours. Yes.
Okay, so I have to play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
I recently joined a Bible study by invite from a friend of mine that I found out the majority of, well, all of them are predeterminationists or predestinations, and Reformed is what they call themselves.
Yeah.
And so I found myself, I thought that was the minority position, and I found out I'm kind of like in the minority within the Protestant community, I guess. So I was given a lot to think about, and this was only a couple weeks ago, so this is like super timely. But the next part of that verse says, "For God works in you." Right. So okay, never mind. Here we go.
Yeah. This is a great one because again, backing up, God started this, but now here's what he started. He's going to finish it. And in the meantime, I want you working this out with fear and trembling, because or for it is God who works in you to will and act in order to fulfill His good purpose. Okay.
There's the faith. The faith that we respond to His grace.
Yes.
Or without faith, we're not going to respond to it.
But God works through His Word, and I thought that's what that was referring to, is that God who works in you through, quote unquote, in parentheses, through His Word, to will and to act in order. It's not that God will somehow miraculously hijack your free will, quote unquote free will, and make you decide this way. He doesn't work it that way, but He does give you His all-powerful Word that works in you to make these choices, right?
But does He? Because I mean, you think back to Pharaoh, and it says God hardened his heart. Like we've seen, and I feel like that's not the only example that we've seen. Like, so it's you kind of get caught in this like, okay, well, which is it?
Romans 9. Are we?
Pharaoh's hardening his heart, and God's hardening his heart,
Yeah.
and God's calling on you to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. God, by whatever means, is in His Word, His Spirit that's been given to you is working in you to have the will. I would take that to be the volition, the desire to act in a way that fulfills His purpose in your life. Now, maybe one way to think about this is, God is always, here's a word for you, wooing. Okay? Any of you guys ever try to woo your girl? Okay? What are you trying to do in that?
Usually impress.
Impress?
Win them over.
You're trying to win them over. You're trying to draw them out, turn their hearts and affections toward you. In Acts 17, Paul, speaking at Mars Hill, talks about that in His providence, God is not far from each one of us, and He's always been at work to do what? I remember how Paul, that we might grope for Him and find Him. And so it is that when He sends His Son into the world, and Jesus is lifted up on the cross, He says He draws all men to Himself. So God's actions in the world, and specifically in Jesus, and most directly in the cross, are God's gracious works of salvation that woo a world, that draw a world to himself. And when we hear that gospel, when we see Christ lifted up on the cross, it generates something within us that wasn't there before, a desire to will and to act in accordance with God's good pleasure. It is an empowering reality because we are now taken in by the beauty and power of God's love for us. And at the wonder of what he's done for me is something that actually begins to change who I am. Does that make any sense? I think that is a good way of maybe trying to conceive of this. Jarrett had actually a good, we were talking about this earlier, and he had I thought a really helpful, none of these illustrations are airtight or cover everything, but I thought it was a pretty good illustration. What was it, Jarrett?
No, put me on the spot. I heard a story one time about there was a man and his son who were on a hike. This is a true story, by the way. But there was a man and his son on a hike, and there was a running, flowing, fast river that they had to cross. The father could cross it no problem. He was a strong, big guy, like 6'4", something like that. And he walked across it just fine. His name was Chester, by the way. But Chester crossed the river. But his son, he was only like 5 or 6 at the time. There was no way that he was going to make it across. And so the father, he stretched out his hand. And in that moment, the boy, Norman, reached out his hand, grabbed onto his dad's. And the father said, like the words that you always hear in the movie, trust me, right? And so he did, and he made it across. But if you think about in that moment, was it so much the trust of that boy, or was there something about he was literally experiencing the strength of his father, to where trust is almost not made irrelevant? He still had to trust his father, but it's as if his father's strength becomes his own in that moment. And so it's like, where does that boy's trust begin and the grace and strength of his father end? Or you could flip it the other way around. At what point does the actual strength of his father end and the trust of that boy begin? Well, they're so interconnected that you can't really separate the two from each other. And perhaps that's what we're grappling with grace and faith.
Because they're working in tandem.
Yes.
They're both working together.
That they're working in tandem, and the priority of God's grace is drawing out of me a faith response. In other words, without God's preliminary or prior acting, there would be nothing to believe in. There would be no hand to reach for. There's nothing there. And again, thinking of what this is, it's a changing of my desires, my affections, my purpose and sense of meaning in life. All of this has to be reoriented, and it all gets reoriented in response to who God is and what he's done, and graciously, and Jarrett's analogy, reaching out to us. Yeah.
To go back from what you started with referencing our discussion about the deity and humanity of Christ, that, those work in tandem too. It's not either or. I think we're believers that it's both. It's deity and humanity. But, it is easy to begin thinking in ways, or accusing others of thinking ways that, well, if you lift this up, it diminishes this, pushes this down. Because we can't fully figure out, well, where do those exactly meet? Now, like you said, I think most of us with God's deity and humanity, we view that as so unresolvable. For Christ, deity and humanity, okay, well, we'll let that go. But it comes to this, and the idea, is it God or man? Well, I think as you're proposing, it's God and man. But that doesn't mean we can figure out exactly where the two intersect. And it is easy to begin saying, well, if you're saying that about man, you're taking away from God. Well, if you're saying that about God, you're taking away from man. Well, that's just as true as it is in the deity and humanity discussion.
Well, let's look at another, one more passage, 1 Corinthians 15:10. This is, Paul's laid out in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through, 4 or 5, what he calls there the gospel, that Jesus has died, was buried, and rose again, and that's what the people have believed. And then he's talking about the various apostles who have been eyewitnesses of the resurrection. And he says, I was the last of these to be a witness of the resurrection. And then he goes on with this sort of biographical expression. He says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. That's an important statement there, and it gets to the heart of some of this. And for me, this is kind of a whole other issue, but there's all these different theories about the nature of man that enter in very much to this discussion, and to what extent the effects of sin, or as theologians like to refer to, the fall, Genesis 3, how profound is the effect of that on us and our ability to respond to God. And that's where a lot of this actually, I think, gets decided in some of these camps. And on the one hand, there's the view that, well, man is so depraved in his sin that there's just no way for him to, in any sense, respond to God apart from some sort of miraculous intervention. Whereas, another view would be with no, man's just fine. He's hunky dory, and as long as you just kind of give him something to believe in, man, he'll do that. But for me, there's got to be some sort of a middle road here, because as we've looked at, for instance, in Ephesians, this description that Paul gives of man, the Gentiles in particular, apart from God, they're described as dead in sin and under the sway of the evil one. There's lengthy descriptions of man's condition apart from God. And Paul, even as a Jew, says, we were just kind of like the rest, like the Gentiles, as he says in Ephesians 2. But by the grace of God, I'm something different. I've been transformed. The grace of God has changed me and made me what I am. And his grace toward me was not for nothing. It wasn't wasted. And extending his grace to me, God's received a return on his investment, as it were. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, speaking of the other apostles. But then again, he kind of comes back and says, but it's not I, but what? The grace of God that is with me. So you get this sense that even in an apostle, there's this struggle to define exactly where the grace of God, who's made me what I am, and my energetic response to God's lavish outpouring of grace that's with me. But it's not, I just don't think that we're going to help ourselves by making it an either or. It is this both and thing.
Martha, I like the word reward. It sounds a lot. The word reward.
Reward.
Which indicates you have to do something. Now, it's God's reward that he grants. I know it's very simplistic, but Paul uses the word, I've done this.
Laid up for me a crown of righteousness. Yeah.
Can we say that that same grace was extended to Pharaoh? That was brought up a minute ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could. Great Pharaoh had the opportunity. The miracles were done. He saw what was happening,
But it was in
and
vain.
he resisted the grace of God. He resisted the Spirit of God, and that's what Stephen says to the Jews: is you always are resisting the Spirit of God.
This is loaded, but I mean, because Jay brought up the Pharaoh again, and that's kind of where I had left it growing up, was that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, but it was really a result of his own stubbornness. And I think there's a verse in the New Testament that goes into that. Like, God's grace is brought to you through his kindness, but because of your stubbornness, you could not accept that. And so it does kind of give this view of, it's man's choice whether he does accept that grace from God. But then Paul talks about Pharaoh again in Romans 9. And I was curious, and this is the loaded question, how would a synergist explain Romans 9 from his point of view?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and Brian talked about that some in the earlier class on the agency of God and the free will of man. And let me come back to that at another time. It's a great question. There's something else I want to try to get to. Just this verse. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. This is a very powerful verse to me in the whole class that we're in this trimester, but on maybe this topic in particular. And it speaks to what we've been trying to say throughout, and that is, let's grapple with this as much as we can, but if you try to get resolution of all of these things in your head's going to split open.
That's the reason it didn't reveal it all.
Yeah. We know God's grace has appeared to us, and we know that to him be all glory and praise and honor both now and forevermore. And we also know that we are called to respond to that grace in faith and in obedience and love. And he gives us specific ways in which we're to do that. And that's our business to attend to that. And when we do so, I think that we can avoid a lot of unnecessary division that has happened through the centuries over this kind of topic. But let me try to, if we've got any time, to give you, this is out of a book, a great book, by the way, on the topic of God's grace, by a guy named John Barclay, called Paul and the Gift. But he talks about the grace of God and various attributes about it that make it so great and amazing. One is its superabundance, its size, or the significance of the gift. And this is the way that the word grace, which means, it's the same word as gift, is used broadly in the first century world, in the Greek-speaking world, to speak of someone's grace or the gift that they give. You talk about its size or significance, its priority, who initiates it? Well, in this case, God certainly initiates the process and was under no obligation to do so. The incongruity, the gifts given are given to those who are totally unworthy of it. There's nothing about the gifts that God gives that are based on a prior value that we are worthship that we had attained to, that made God made it incumbent upon God to show us this grace. And then fourthly, its efficacy. It fully achieves what it was designed to do, which again is what Paul talks about in how it was not in vain. So it's a grace because it is so great, because God initiates it, because it's given to the unworthy, that it draws forth from us out of our depths what we could not have been without it. Could not have been without it. All right. Well, thank you all for your good comments and questions.